Welcome back to the Tamez Labs podcast. I'm your host, Tripwire. Today on the show, iconic cartoon starlet Betty Boop and teenage sleuth Nancy Drew enter the public domain, sending Hollywood into a frenzy. All right, so in a few days, on January 1st, we're getting what I like to call the manipulating cultural jailbreak of 2026. Betty Boop, Nancy Drew, The Maltese Falcon, Georgia on My Mind, All Quiet on the Western Front. They're all busting out of copyright prison and crossing into the public domain. Which means you can finally do whatever you want with them. Write fan fiction, make movies, put Betty Boop on a tote bag without some lawyer sending you a strongly worded letter that makes you question all your life choices. But here's where it gets fun. Someone's already lawyering up to tell you you're wrong about what you can actually do with it. Let's start with Betty Boop, because she's the perfect example of how intellectual property turns into a full contact sport. When she first showed up in Dizzy Dishes, she had dog ears. Actual dog ears. A flapper with canine features doing that boop-oop-a-doop thing in a short dress with a garter, hair in perfect curls. She was everything Fleischer Studios stood for. New York sophistication, animation made for adults. The kind of cheeky energy that would get completely censored once the Hays Code stomped in during 34. She wasn't wholesome Midwest values. She was cosmopolitan and a little risque, designed for grown-ups in theaters, not kids at Saturday matinees. Now, the original Fleischer Studios sold everything to Paramount in 41, went out of business in 46. Paramount then sold to UM&M TV Corp in 55, but explicitly kept the Betty Boop character copyright. That's where things start getting messy. Because in the 70s, descendants of Max Fleischer formed a new company, bought back what they could through various chains of acquisition, and have been enforcing Betty Boop rights ever since. Except in 2011, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals looked at all those transfers and said, "You don't actually own this. Your chain of title is broken. UM&M never had Betty Boop to sell in the first place, so you couldn't have bought what they didn't possess." That was a 2-to-1 decision, by the way, not unanimous. And Fleischer Studios is not backing down. They've put out statements saying Betty Boop isn't entering the public domain, that the 1930 character is just a precursor with dog ears, and the fully developed Betty, the one who lost those ears and got hoop earrings in 32, is what they own. They're sitting on multiple trademarks. They spent over 500 hours compiling lists of what is and isn't public domain, and they're making it very clear they'll defend their position. Which, sounds like someone's got a lot of time and a lot of lawyers on retainer. Here's the thing about that strategy. It doesn't have to win in court to work. It just has to create enough uncertainty that small creators, independent filmmakers, theater companies, anyone without deep pockets for litigation, they all think twice. They see the cease and desist letter coming and decide it's not worth the fight. That's the game. Not winning, just making you too afraid to play. We've seen this before. The Conan Doyle estate kept charging licensing fees for Sherlock Holmes years after he should have been public domain, banking on the fact that paying a modest fee seemed more rational than paying lawyers. A federal judge called it what it was: extortion. Said the estate was charging fees for which there is no legal basis, and hoping people would pay rather than face legal costs. The Seventh Circuit called the whole thing frivolous, but it worked for years because most people just paid. Same thing happened with Happy Birthday. Warner Music claimed copyright, collected licensing fees from restaurants and films and TV shows. Turned out, they never had valid copyright in the first place. Took a class action lawsuit to settle it, and suddenly, the most performed song in English was free. The pattern is consistent. Rights holders make claims that stretch or outright break the law, not because they'll win, but because the threat is enough.
My name is Tom Sachs. I'm an artist in New York City. For nearly 2 decades, I have been collaborating with Nike.
Nike running is for runners, Nike basketball is for basketball. Nike craft is for everyone else.
Now let's zoom out. Why are we even having this conversation about works from 1930? Because originally, under the 1790 Copyright Act, these would have entered public domain in 1958, after 28 years. Then, Congress extended the term, pushing it to 1986 after 56 years. Then to 2006 after 75 years. Then, the Copyright Term Extension Act of '98, nicknamed the Sonny Bono Act, but let's be honest, it should be called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, pushed it to 95 years. Each extension was sold as incentivizing creation. The argument goes, knowing your work will generate income for your heirs decades from now motivates you to create it today. Except 17 economists, including 5 Nobel laureates, filed a brief saying the '98 extension provided no significant incentive to create new works. Economic models suggest the optimal copyright term is around 35 years. After that, you're not encouraging creation. You're just letting corporations exploit old catalogs. And here's the kicker. Only about 2% of copyrights between 55 and 75 years old retain any commercial value. The percentage drops even lower after 75 years. So we're locking away 98% of our cultural heritage, works that nobody's selling, nobody's distributing, nobody can even find the owners for, to protect the 2% that Disney and a handful of other corporations are still milking. The beneficiaries aren't creators. They're dead. The beneficiaries are businesses that want to keep exploiting content that still produces revenue. Mickey Mouse, Betty Boop, franchises that have been merchandised into the ground. Meanwhile, the harm is tangible. Films from 1930 have literally disintegrated because preservationists couldn't legally digitize them. Community theaters are told they can't screen public domain films without paying fees that have no legal basis. Teachers can't share historical materials with students. Scholars can't analyze works that are locked away with untraceable owners. Jennifer Jenkins at Duke Center for the Study of the Public Domain put it simply. So many works could have been rediscovered earlier. So many works don't make it out of obscurity. But here's what happens when they do make it out. When The Great Gatsby entered public domain, we got multiple new editions, adaptations, creative reimaginings. Empirical studies show public domain books become cheaper, available in more formats, more likely to stay in print. Youth orchestras can perform I Got Rhythm without licensing fees. Schools can teach the Maltese Falcon without worrying about permissions. The Internet Archive can host full texts. Culture becomes accessible again. And yes, we also get low-budget horror films. Winnie the Pooh slasher, Mickey Mouse slasher. There's apparently a Betty Boop horror film in development. That's the price of freedom. Some of it will be trash, but most of it won't endure anyway. And in exchange, we get the full spectrum of creative possibility. We get serious adaptations, scholarly analysis, preservation, education, and weird experimental stuff that couldn't exist under licensing regimes. The Supreme Court has been pretty clear about this. In Dastar versus 20th Century Fox, they warned against misuse or overextension of trademark and related protections into areas traditionally occupied by copyright. You can't use trademark law to create perpetual copyright. Once the copyright expires, the work is free. Trademark only prevents you from confusing consumers about the source of a product. You can make a Betty Boop musical. You just can't imply it's officially endorsed by Fleischer Studios when it's not. The Ninth Circuit already addressed this with Betty Boop specifically. They said using her name was a functional aesthetic component, not trademark infringement. Because she's a character, and once she's public domain, you need to be able to use her name to tell people what you're doing. But Fleischer Studios is betting most people don't know that. They're betting on uncertainty.
Building a new product? Tamez Labs takes you from napkin sketch to the App Store. Trusted by Fortune 500s for quality, security, and speed. Book your free strategy session at tamez.ai.
So what does this mean for you? If you're a creator, you can now legally make new works featuring these characters without permission or fees. You can write Nancy Drew novels. You can produce Blondie and Dagwood adaptations. You can sample Dream a Little Dream of Me without clearing rights. You can screen All Quiet on the Western Front for free. You just have to be willing to stand your ground if someone sends a letter. And maybe that's the real story here. Not just what's entering the public domain, but who's willing to fight for it. Because the law says these works are ours now, all of ours. But there are people with business models built on pretending they're not. In 2028, the fully human Betty Boop, no dog ears, just hoop earrings, enters public domain too. If there's going to be a lawsuit, it'll probably happen before then. Someone will make something. Fleischer will sue. And we'll find out whether that 2011 ruling holds, or whether there's some other chain of title they've quietly acquired, or whether this whole thing gets settled quietly, with nobody ever knowing the answer. That's the game. Keep it murky, keep it expensive, keep people guessing. But here's what I keep coming back to. Max Fleischer said, if it can be done in real life, it isn't animation. He was talking about the surreal, impossible, imaginative work his studio created, the stuff that could only exist in cartoons. And now, that work is free. Not because anyone wanted to give it away, but because that's how the system is supposed to work. You get your monopoly for a while, and then it belongs to everyone. 95 years is too long. We all know it. But at least the clock eventually runs out. You can show our podcast team some love with 5 stars and a follow. Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Grep News. Tamez.